Section C, 2024, Paper 2. Let's get right on with it. Evaluate macroeconomic policies that could be used to reduce a current account deficit. Refer to a country of your choice in your answer. So this sounds like a really good 25-mark question, quite a unique one. Let's have a look at the stimulus. So it talks about Brazil's current account deficit. It gives you a good figure, it's 46.12 billion. Central bank tried to intervene by selling its own currency, which of course one strategy we can use to reduce current account deficit. It's first time it's intervened in its foreign currency markets since 2021. What does that suggest? This suggests it managed exchange rate, doesn't it? As if you can recall, a floating exchange rate is left completely to the market, so the market supply and demand determines the value of the currency, whilst a managed exchange rate, it means that the central bank would intervene to try influence the value of the currency, which of course this stimulus suggests Brazil is a managed exchange rate. And of course, like I emphasised, real world application. Here again, you need to know a really good country fact file, maybe one or two here for like 2 different paragraphs, to be able to comment on the current account deficit and how we can use a policy to improve the current account deficit. So definitely just shows the need for real world application. But yeah, let's get started and let's have a shot at answering this. Now, I really think this is a great question, especially for revision, for practice. Such a common current account question and really test your knowledge on it. But let's get started with a few of the policies, since there's a range of policies. There's lots of different ways you can go about answering this question. First thing first, of course, what is a stimulus referring to? When the central bank has intervened to sell its own currency. Of course, that is all to do with foreign currency reserves. As of course, countries can use their foreign currency reserves. For example, China has around $3 trillion in their foreign currency reserves. They can sell off their domestic currency, so the yuan in this example, and by selling off their domestic currency, what does it mean? It depreciates the exchange rate, shifts out the supply curve for the currency, depreciates the exchange rate, and of course a depreciated currency, if you think about spicy, the opposite of spicy, weaker pound, imports expensive, exports cheaper, therefore of course improving the current account. Therefore that could be a really solid paragraph, especially of course adding a lot more detail to it, a lot more application. But yeah, that is definitely my first point. Now of course there are definitely other ways we can depreciate this exchange rate, and I'm sure one that a lot of you guys would be thinking is of course expansionary monetary policy. So therefore of course we reduce the interest rates. And why would a reduction in interest rates depreciate our exchange rate? Since of course a reduction in interest rates is all to do with hot money flows, as with the reduced interest rates, it's less lucrative for foreign investors to invest into, for example, the UK. Therefore, they invest less into the UK and they try to pull their money out of the UK. Therefore, increase the supply of pounds. Therefore, depreciates the UK's exchange rate. And that is definitely another policy you can use to depreciate the exchange rate. So, yeah, 100%, if you want to use it, expansion monetary policy is a totally valid way of going about this question. And the way I would decide which one to use, just think about for you, which can you develop the longer chain of analysis for, and as the one that you can develop the longer, the more developed chain of analysis, you're more likely to pick up marks, and that's how to distinguish between good points. Now, the second policy I am going to use in this question is all to do with a very small part of the spec, which is expenditure reducing and expenditure switching policies. And this is why I always say these 25-mark questions, they're always somehow linked, since the expenditure reducing policies examples are things like tariffs, things like subsidies to domestic producers, and of course, what are they? They're all in the topic of globalization. And what is the second 25-mark question? It's on globalization also. But yeah, so which policy would I use? So for the expenditure reducing policies, a great one, of course, is tariffs. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are very comfortable, are very well versed in the tariff chain of analysis. Just a little mistake there. I said the wrong thing and somehow wrote the wrong thing as well. Tariffs, subsidies to domestic producers would in fact be examples of expenditure switching policies, as expenditure reducing policies are they're fairly negative. They're not really used a lot. They're things like contractionary policies, like contractionary fiscal, contractionary monetary. Why? Contractionary policies, they're just contracting the economy. They decrease real GDP. Therefore, individuals have less disposable income, can spend less consumption. Thus, of course, they curb consumption. But also the massive problem with expenditure reducing policies is that, of course, if there's less GDP is a really good indicator. Well, it's an indicator for living standards. So if you're pursuing contractionary policies to try to reduce spending, you're also just worsening living standards. Individuals cannot buy as many goods and services they want and need. And what's that another word for? They demand. Therefore, if individuals can't buy goods and services they want and demand, you talk about consumer welfare, consumer surplus obviously massively decreases, and overall real GDP and living standards decrease. But back onto this. Expenditure switching policies like tariffs. Like I said, a lot of you guys are well versed in tariffs. I am briefly going to go through this tariff paragraph. what I want to try to give you with this question, there's several past papers I've gone through now, done the exact tariff diagram, perfect A-star level with the exact share analysis. I want to give you guys more of a diverse portfolio, so if a hard question comes up, you guys have lots of different ways to answer the question, lots of different A-star chains of analysis. So I will briefly go through tariffs, but I am going to focus this paragraph on subsidies to domestic producers. So instead of being like a one-trick pony, you know, several different A-star top-level diagrams, chains of analysis, so any sort of difficult, maybe curveball question, you can navigate it. And this is why year on year in the live classes, we're basically just pumping out A-stars. We're essentially, at You Do Econ, the McDonald's produces beef burgers, we just produce economic A-star students. So of course, the question is asking us to refer to a country of our choice when we're talking about this expenditure switching policy. So how would I go about it? One macroeconomic policy that could, and I'm going to go through this really briefly, like I said, one macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce the current account deficit is an expenditure switching policy, such as imposing a tariff. Of course, a tariff is a tax on imports, and let's stop the chain analysis there. I'm going to give an example first, state your point, then application. So for example, a great example of this is the US-China trade war, still going on now in 2025. Now, of course, the US current account deficit didn't just magically disappear when they set these tariffs, but it massively decreased, it significantly decreased that current account deficit between US and China. As for example, during 2019, the imports from China into the US decreased around 20%, which is of course very significant. What does that mean? Massive reduction in import expenditure, and if the massive reduction in import expenditure, of course, improves that trade balance and thus improves that current account deficit. So quick, simple tariff chain analysis. What is a tariff? It's tax on imports. This therefore makes imports more expensive. If imports are more expensive, what is going to happen? The quantity imported will reduce. Of course, show this all in the tariff diagram. Again, think about the other things on the tariff diagram. That consumer surplus, of course, can be shown when imports are more expensive. There's a reduction in consumer surplus. But how do consumers respond to the more expensive imports? Lots of them will switch from importing goods to now consuming goods which are domestically produced. So buying goods from domestic producers, which of course, if you can imagine on the diagram, I'm going to literally do it with my hands. The gap used to be this, Q1 to Q4, and now the gap is this. So the quantity imported reduces. As like I said, consumers are substituting to domestic producers instead of importing, thus reducing import expenditure. And like I said, at the end of the chain, it reduces the current account deficit. And just for those of you who want to add a bit more detail there, of course, with a tariff, and with the current account, there's imports and exports. And with tariffs, you are mostly focusing on the quantity imported, but you can comment on the exports for these producers now. So you could just say exports remain relatively the same, but also you could talk about maybe a different time frame. In the long run, these domestic producers, as they're going to experience an increase in demand by domestic producers. This, if you think about economies of scale, again in macro, that's a great diagram to draw. Yes, it's a micro diagram, but has many links to the macro, and 100% a great and a relevant diagram to draw. Domestic consumers are increasing demand for domestically produced goods. This of course means domestic producers are making more sales, more revenue, and therefore could be making more profits. And of course, with them experiencing higher demand, there's more output, and as we know, what are economies of scale? How do you define economy of scale? When output increases, we can also say long run average cost falls. So you could say in the long run, exports could become more competitive. Why? Since these domestic firms could now experience economies of scale, which is obviously a really good point. So it means the import expenditure is decreasing. The export revenue, since exports are more competitive, since they are cheaper on global markets, will increase, thus of course improving the current account deficit. And of course you can relate it again back to the US, where it meant that the current account deficit with China did reduce. And if you want to be specific, you can say the bilateral deficit between US and China was reduced. But like I said, I've done the tariff chain analysis, done the diagram, whole explanation before in other past paper videos, and I want to give you guys like diversity. You have a really good depth of knowledge, a really good depth of different A-star chains, and this is exactly what builds that A-star student. Since this is why in the community we get a record number of A-stars every single year, since we just make sure you're prepared to the highest level, they can throw anything at you and you'll still be able to smash it out. Like for example, this recent 2025 paper, especially if you're on social media, a lot of you guys might have seen everyone's talking about how these year's A-levels have been extremely hard. Our students were completely fine with it. We prepare you for literally everything, so there's nothing to worry about. But let's get back on with the question, and specifically with the second, and the one I'm going to go into detail with, the second expenditure switching policy, which is subsidies to domestic producers. So let's get started. Straight from the examiners, straight from Edexcel, The first thing they said, this was a good point, so subsidies to domestic producers, but the main thing students were limited on was the diagram. A lot of students just drew a subsidy, like a micro, a year 12 diagram, but that is not going to cut it with this. Of course, for this question, and again for your depth of knowledge, you should in fact know a trade subsidy diagram, and since that was one of the main things examiners did pick up on, let's start with the trade subsidy diagram. I don't know why I'm drawing it in green, but yeah, let's get started. So of course we have just our curves. So y-axis, x-axis, and trade subsidy diagram is exactly the same. It's just price, quantity. Essentially, it just looks like a tariff diagram, but then you just add a subsidy to it. So let's show you how this looks like. So it's S, and like I said, just like a tariff diagram, supply, and that is domestic. Then we have demand, which of course D, and D domestic, and then we would, just like in a tariff diagram, we would draw our world price or world supply, then we'd label that world price. Now, how does this differ from a tariff diagram? So this, for most of you, will look like an incompleted tariff diagram, or for those of you that know, this would also look like a free trade diagram, which is of course a really good diagram for you guys to memorize. Well, it literally just is this, but it's a good diagram to be able to reference. But now, how would we add the subsidy to this diagram? So it looks something like this essentially. You just pick a random quantity, you go from there, you do something like this, and so that is not a good point, so I'm going to do that again. So I'm just going to go a bit wider. That looks good. So make sure it's perpendicular, and this would now be S supply domestic plus subsidy, and let's just add on our points. So just going to extend that out. That is now Q3, and this is the new price, world price plus sub. Main thing students get confused on each year with this diagram are these two prices. If you really want to, and you don't want to learn anything more, just ignore this price, and you can just focus on this. Essentially, for consumers, the price does not change at all. The price is always going to be at world price, or whatever you want to call that. But what does this price then represent? It represents the new effective price for producers after the subsidy. But now let's answer the question. So one macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce a current account deficit is the expenditure reducing policy of subsidizing domestic producers. Now, like I say, state your point, move on to application before starting the chain of analysis. Why is the perfect paragraph structure state your point, application, then analysis, since we want that consistency? And this is just built from hundreds, probably even thousands of students now, just testing the students, since if you put the application before your analysis, you're much more likely to remember it. A lot of students will get to nearly the end of the paragraph and forget to add any application. So at least, of course, embed application in your chains of analysis, but at least if you've got that just after your point, you've pretty much consistently including application in every single one of your paragraphs. And that's exactly what you need for that top level. Now the question is asking, refer to a country of your choice, and a great example I do teach on subsidizing domestic producers, and I'm sure a lot of you will know this, is in fact the, you might know it as CAP, or the Common Agricultural Policy within the EU. What does this do? Essentially, it's just subsidizing EU farmers. They give EU farmers money, which of course relates to our example perfectly. Now, more specifically, in the example I teach in the live classes is Romania. Romania is one of the biggest receivers of this CAP, the Common Agricultural Subsidy. They receive about between 2023 and 2027, they're estimated to receive 20 billion worth of the subsidy. So of course it works quite well. And the reason why we are specifically choosing Romania also does have a current account deficit. Therefore, it works almost perfectly for this question. Of course, I always say to my students, you chose Edexcel, well, you're doing Edexcel, and one of the biggest precursors with Edexcel is that depth, that just massive need for real-world application, countries, fact files, industries. You need to know all of them to a really good extent and be able to relate them to the question. As I'm telling you, I see top-level students every single year. I see hundreds of them every single year. The top level of students can do this, and they are the students who consistently, year on year, are achieving the A-star. So if you cannot do it, you will not be one of those A-star or even A students. So we've done the application, now let's move on to the analysis. So point, application, analysis, let's get started. So what is happening? So the government has subsidized domestic producers. When the government subsidizes these domestic producers, of course, it reduces the cost of production for these domestic producers. How can we see this on the diagram? We can see this on the diagram, of course, from when SD, so supply domestic, shifts outwards to now SD plus subsidy. Now, a good thing to remember is the vertical distance between the supply domestic, just like a normal subsidy diagram, the vertical distance between these two would represent the cost per unit of the subsidy. Or you could say the value of the subsidy per unit. But by the government subsidizing this firm, or these firms, it means that now what has happened to the quantities, which is the most important thing. Since if you look at this just as a classic trade diagram, of course, what would the quantity show? Initially, it shows the quantity imported is between Q1 and Q2. So that represents, just like we would label on a tariff diagram, it represents the quantity imported. But now, after the government has now subsidized these firms, it's caused the supply curve shift out to SD plus subsidy, we now have a new quantity of Q3. Therefore, it means that the quantity imported has now decreased. So initially we were at Q1, Q2, and again, I need to emphasize, you need to use these points in your analysis. If you're not mentioning these points in your analysis, you're just leaving marks on the table. So you need to make sure one of the biggest things, make sure all these little points you include, WP, Q1, Q2, Q3, mention them all in your chain of analysis, spam them in. But now, the quantity imported decreases from Q1 to Q2 to now Q3, Q2, which is the new quantity imported after domestic producers have been subsidized. And why is that? That is because consumers have now substituted away from importing goods to now just purchasing from domestic producers. So the increase in domestic producer supply has substituted for the need of imports. Now, for the high level students, there is a really cool thing you can show in this diagram. So you can show the difference between the boxes of domestic producer revenue before the subsidy and after the subsidy. So before the subsidy, the domestic producer revenue was this box here, so WPQ1. But now, after the subsidy, the domestic producer revenue is now this much larger box. And that, of course, shows the incentive and shows why these firms, these subsidized firms, are deciding to produce a higher quantity. And if you wanted to, in your exam, you could label WP A, B, and say, so the domestic producer revenue has increased from WP A, B, Q1 to now WP plus S, C, Q3, D, something like that. But now, of course, with import demand decreasing, it will lead to the classical chain of analysis, less import expenditure, less demand for foreign currencies, therefore improving our trade balance, and thus, the main thing, improving Romania's current account deficit. And of course, at the end, just link it back to the question. So less import demand is of course going to lead to less import expenditure. There's going to be less foreign currency transactions, better trade balance. And the main thing we're linking it to, it improves Romania's current account deficit, which is currently sitting at 8.3% of Romania's GDP. And I hope you guys can see that is not a hard paragraph, very similar to your trade, your tariff diagrams, just a bit of a twist on it. Make sure you know the diagram to a good extent. If you want me to, leave a comment. I can do a full video on how to construct this diagram. But yeah, a really good one, and a good one to practice to make sure you're comfortable with also saying, you're comfortable with the paragraph of subsidizing domestic producers. Let's now move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. And the first one, and a really great one, specifically to do with subsidizing domestic producers, this is why I emphasize you have to practice different paragraphs. You have to practice different chains of analysis, since this is a really specific and a really good evaluation point for this diagram, for this paragraph. And it means that if you practice them in your exam, if this question comes up, you can rewrite, you can pretty much recall this exact one. But the way the word is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of retaliation. As when the EU subsidizes via the Common Agriculture Policy, when they subsidize these Romanian farmers, this distorts the theory of comparative advantage. And why is that? Since these farmers do not have a comparative advantage in producing, they don't have the lowest opportunity cost in farming. For example, there might be farmers across the world who have a lower opportunity cost of producing these these agricultural goods, whereas by the EU subsidizing them, they're artificially giving them lower costs, therefore distorting the theory of comparative advantage, which in fact we can see on this diagram, which this triangle here is a triangle, just like on your tariff diagram you would see a triangle of deadweight welfare loss. This is also deadweight welfare loss of efficiency, and this would therefore trigger retaliation. So for example, if your country had the comparative advantage in farming, maybe you had a big farming exporting sector, and now EU is giving billions out in subsidies, it would trigger some sort of response, which is retaliation. And for example, a great example of this is the EU's CAP, so the Common Agriculture Policy, versus the US's retaliation, as the US realised that with the EU's new policy of CAP, they are basically dominating the markets, they're flooding the agriculture markets. So the US responded, they tried to go through the WTO, but then they ended up responding themselves with the Farm Bill, which is essentially just a retaliation measure to the EU's Common Agriculture Policy. And how does this relate to the question? This retaliation can lead to trade barriers like tariffs. Therefore, it could actually, if for example, if Romania import lots from the US, due to this policy, it could lead to high tariffs the US set on Romania, thus meaning if Romanian consumers import lots from the US, it could actually lead to a worsened current account rather than a improved current account. So it could worsen the current account deficit due to retaliation by foreign countries rather than bettering or making the current account better. So in summary, by the EU subsidizing its Romanian farmers, it distorts the theory of comparative advantage. This can lead to countries like the US responding, and that could actually, in the end, lead to a worsened current account deficit due to things like tariffs, trade barriers. If, for example, Romanian consumers import lots from countries like the US or whichever country sets trade barriers on them. So there's a bit of a more complex evaluation point, but nonetheless, a very, very detailed and very specific evaluation point. And of course, you're using the diagram in it, you're using the diagram you've drawn, it says top marks, absolute top level evaluation point. And of course, all the subsidies evaluation points you've learned in micro, they still work quite well here as well. For example, a great one here is that, yes, we've got an increase in quantity, and we're assuming that this increase in quantity supplied by domestic producers is going to lead to a reduction in the quantity imported from Q1, Q2 to now Q3, Q2. But this also doesn't just depend on the quantity, it depends on the quality. Since if these domestic producers are just producing absolute garbage, yes, they can produce lots of it, but will domestic consumers actually purchase? Probably not. So it will not actually reduce the quantity imported. So the current account improving doesn't just depend on whether the domestic producers increase their supply, so produce more quantity. It also depends on what they're actually producing, the quality of what they are producing. Also, a great evaluation point specifically to do with the application with the common agricultural policy. One thing we saw, especially in the 1980s, as a few of you might know, is massive overproduction. So in the EU, if you type in wine lakes and butter mountains, they're known from when in 1980s, 1990s, since EU farmers were subsidised, they basically produced way too much and led to massive wastage, massive just dumping on international markets of these resources, and just a lot of it was just had to be destroyed since they just produced way too much. So that is, of course, allocative inefficiency is a massive wastage, which subsidies and will not also, massive thing, will not help improve the current account deficit. And then you can of course comment on the next best alternative. Instead of them subsidizing these firms and these firms ending up wasting it, they could have spent that on another policy, an alternative policy, like something like, since remember, also big thing that just popped into my mind is subsidies cost the government money, don't they? It costs the government to provide a subsidy. That is the trade barrier. Whereas if they used an alternative policy like tariffs instead of costing the government, they bring in government revenue. So you could say the cost of the next best alternative, the cost of subsidies, the opportunity cost, you could have instead pursued tariffs. So essentially, instead of using a subsidy which uses up tax revenue, they could have used tariffs which makes tax revenue. Now, like I said, there's several different evaluation points you can go into depth with and pick up top marks for, but they're just some examples of what I was thinking. Now, let's move on to the second paragraph and construct that A-star chain of analysis for this one. Let's get on with the second paragraph. One macroeconomic policy that could be used to reduce a current account deficit is foreign currency reserves. Why? Since they depreciate the exchange rate. For example, China holds around 3 trillion worth of foreign currencies, and for you students, to put that into some perspective, the UK holds around 118 billion. That is just 3.5% of what China holds. So every $1 the UK has in foreign currency reserves, the China has $29, which of course shows why China is a heavyweight on forex market. So now we've done the point application, now onto the analysis, and here I'm just explaining how foreign currency reserves work. So the Central Bank of China will sell their domestic currency, which is yuan, and this is as China has a managed exchange rate system, just like we mentioned a long time ago now, but we mentioned that Brazil also has a managed exchange rate system. But what will they do? They'll, on forex markets, they will buy foreign currency with their own domestic currency. Now, by using their domestic currency on the forex market, what are they doing? They're essentially increasing the supply of the yuan. And what can we show that on? Of course, we can show that on a diagram. And what diagram is this? This is the exchange rate diagram. Now, this is a great diagram I emphasize students to make sure you remember, since it's very simple, just essentially a supply and demand diagram with the exchange rate on the y-axis and quantity of yuan or whatever currency you're referring to on the x-axis. And here, so we just have our supply and demand, and like we said, we're going to get an increase in supply of yuan, so thus causing supply to shift to S plus 1. Now let's see what effect is that having on the axes. And so let's start from our original equilibrium, which is ER1, and now Q1, and then with the shift out of supply, what's going to happen? Of course, if we now see exchange rate has depreciated, has decreased from ER1 to ER2, and like I just said, we would call that a depreciation, and quantity has also increased. The yuan has depreciated. Let's think about spicy now. So exports are going to become cheaper. If exports are cheaper, they are more internationally competitive, thus export revenue will rise. And let's think about the opposite side of the spectrum, imports. Imports are now more expensive, thus import expenditure will now decrease. And of course, that is the perfect scenario. We have less imports, more export expenditure, thus meaning that, of course, the trade balance improves and we narrow that current account deficit. Now, before you guys get on to me, of course, China does not have a current account deficit, and I'm also aware of this. And this is why it also works as a great evaluation point here. So one really good evaluation point I would use here is use a real world application. As theoretically, yeah, it makes sense that we've said that China's current account deficit is narrowing, but in reality, we all know that China does not have a current account deficit. So would this, you could comment on whether this will be ineffective, whether China would realistically, they would never use a policy like this since they don't need to pursue an improvement of their current account. But now moving on to probably the best evaluation point, especially for this question, and the one you guys have been waiting for, is of course to do the Marshall-Lerner condition, the J-Curve. And how would I word this evaluation point? However, in evaluation, the depreciation of the currency improving the current account deficit depends on the time frame. And of course, the main thing to use in conjunction with this is the infamous diagram. I love it because it's a bit different to the normal diagrams. What's on our axis is of course balance, and make sure you draw this out, write this out fully, balance of payments on the current account on the y-axis, and then on your x-axis is of course time. Then we have positive, we have negative current account, and of course the J-curve looks something like this. And you try to get the point where it goes from being, well, it starts sloping upwards, and this point here, of course, you could label this this is where the Marshall-Lerner condition is satisfied. And what does that mean? What is the Marshall-Lerner condition itself? Is that the PED of exports plus the PED of imports is now greater than 1. So that is the difference. This little very dodgy line by me, but this is the difference between the short run and the long run. So let's go back. However, in evaluation, depreciation of a currency improving the current account deficit depends on the time frame. But before we get into it, this is why it's important to check my diagram, since I did check it just before I was about to start speaking, and I did realise I have made a mistake here. So firstly, that's just like a little error where I've wrote 0 instead of putting negative, but the J-curve is technically meant to start below, so start at negative. So I did accidentally write that above. It is probably because I am teaching and I'm speaking at the same time, so I'm a bit distracted. But yeah, so it should just start below the shouldn't start in the positive side. As shown by the J-curve, in the short run, the current account deficit actually gets worse. And why is this? This is as demand for imports, we say in the short run, is inelastic. As for example, firms are tied down to contracts. So we have a really bad combination where we have firms, since they're tied down to contracts, they're importing the same quantity, and then we have a depreciated currency. So essentially now they need to spend more of that currency to get the same amount of imports. Thus, of course, as we can see on the J-curve diagram, it means that in the short run, our current account deficit gets worse. But then in the long run, the demand for imports becomes more elastic, as for example, firms have time, the contract's now expired, they have time to negotiate a better deal contract, thus meaning, as you can see, the deficit on the current account improves. But of course, this all is based on the fact, and it's based on the assumption that the Marshall-Lerner condition is met, which is when the PED of exports plus the PED of imports is greater than 1. But of course, make sure you know the Marshall-Lerner condition in depth, you know how to draw the diagram, you know how to word the chain analysis, you know what the Marshall-Lerner condition actually means. And like I will say, depth of understanding with these diagrams is absolutely key for you to be able to demonstrate that knowledge, develop those chains of analysis, pick up those evaluation marks. But yeah, they are two of the main evaluation points I would use for this paragraph. Like I said, there's a lot more you can go through.